I was informed that we can start. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for attending this track. My name is Bruno Banelli, and on behalf of company Sartura, I will give you a brief overview and rundown of the Dent Project. Dent Project being under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation and tackling something that we like to call open source networking, which is a topic that is not new, that is not yet to come, but is already here. However, through this presentation, the overview and the emphasis of that overview will be on the Dent project, but will also be on the fact how the Linux Foundation governs its projects, why this is good for open source projects, and what is the future and the expectation of open source networking. Before we begin, I will just give a very brief introduction of myself so that you have a rough acquaintance of who is actually standing in front of you. So I've been in both business and development for more than 15 years now. Lately, unfortunately, I'm doing more business than development, but when I catch time, and by catching time, I mean when I'm forced by my team to participate in the development, this is mostly Golang, and in some parts, which I hate, C. In any case, as I've said, I'm active member of various Linux Foundation and OCP projects, and also teaching at few Croatian universities, University of Algebra, our host today, being one of them as well. But enough about me, let's talk about the project. Before we start the project and its details, I think it is worthwhile spending few minutes on getting the ones of you here who are not sufficiently acquainted with the Linux Foundation, what the Linux Foundation actually is. And in spite of the name Linux in the Foundation's name, the Linux Foundation went far, far, far beyond the Linux. I have had the pleasure of being on the 30th anniversary of Linux inception in 2021 in Napa Valley, California, where we celebrated the 30th birthday of Linux as we know it nowadays, very much evolved from its original origins, becoming de facto a standard for a large amount of usages and utilizations nowadays. However, as you can see through these logos here, there are plenty of projects within the LF. There are plenty of sub-foundations within the LF. And you can see that LF tackles variety of business branches, and one of them being, for example, energy, which is very interesting. Parallel with this event, there is an event in Denver where the Linux Foundation is participating in, and now I just hope that my dear colleague Dan Brown will not hate me for this, but I think that is something along the lines of standardizing chargers for electric vehicles. I would presume that many of projects that are here are familiar to most of you. You probably know that so many projects live under Cloud Native Computing Foundation, etc., etc. And now the main question is, why would so many projects want to go under the umbrella of the LF? And through the presentation of the Dent project and through the presentation of how the whole project is governed, you will actually see what is the strength of having Linux Foundation covering your project and what is the strength of including the project within the scope of work that LF offers. briefly, and I will not spend much time here, there are some interesting concepts and ideas how open source projects should work, since, as I've said, I teach at Croatian universities, and being in touch with students, the big problem that we have nowadays is, and this is something that was also mentioned on yesterday's Open for Business conference that DORS held as well, we no longer, you know what, I'll give you like 30 seconds just to sit. And the sooner you sit, the sooner the lunch will start. So it's all beneficial. Well, I'm no longer young. There are people here that are older than me, but most of people here are younger than me. And this is great, because having youth on an open source conference is unfortunately not something that is very common nowadays. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you would have a bunch of enthusiasts. Let's not call them geeks because it's probably not politically correct, but these people were heavily involved in the process of creating the open source as we know it nowadays, only that 20 or 30 years later, we would not have sufficient traction and not have a basic understanding what open source actually is and what benefit it gives us. Starting from the first question, what does free means? And especially if we put it into context of Croatian, we have multiple words describing the English word free. And you know how the English language usually describes that. So we have a free speech and we have a free meal. And these are not same forms of freedom. Being able to comprehend what open source is and what the concepts of open source are is very important for any young developer wishing to participate in their professional career, being efficient and being useful to the community. And this is something that we all have to try to work on, and especially people of my age and older. So the ancients should be the ones that give additional wind to young people to grasp and comprehend those concepts. So why are we talking about the open networking within the edge and IoT? As you probably know, and I will skip this slide because I don't like to bore people with too much text, but I think that next few slides should probably be more interesting. It would seem that I don't even have them. Oh, I do. Okay. So this is a very important slide. When we talk about the networking, people nowadays that came to the market, to the IT market, ICT market, development market, probably do not comprehend or fully grasp what lies behind it. To skip ahead, we are all witnessing nowadays a big trend of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, which is very cool and can have this feel like of being impressive. But in the end, we could discuss how actually having statistics give you answers to your prompts is impressive or is not. But the reason why this particular branch became very successful is network. We wouldn't have internet without network, logically, nor would we be able to gather here in this amount and allow colleagues that cannot join us to witness this whole event without the network. But network has its problems. Network is very old and network is very ancient. And working on those bases and principles, the issue rose, and the issue is we have a very traditional ancient dinosaur system. And this is this closed hardware-software legacy integration. Although it says legacy integration, it really isn't legacy. If you, and I will not name the brands, but if you take any popular vendor of switching equipment nowadays, not only switching equipment, we can go to wireless access points or whatever, you will find a very rigid, very closed system that does not allow any penetration of open source as we would like to utilize it and as we like it and know it in 2024. There is a very good reason for that, and a very good reason is called system-on-a-chip vendors. So these vendors, being traditional and naturally being drawn by profit, have a very, very closed system around them and are basically steering that system however they want. And this is ranging from super cheap semi-managed switch to the enterprise equipment, 1.6 terabits, that should be actual by the end of this year or starting next year. But unfortunately, this has proven to be quite difficult for the users of that equipment. And users of that equipment is all of us, but do not forget that users of that equipment also go by very large-scale companies that you wouldn't believe have incredible demands for the networking. Join us, don't close the doors. Oh, he left, okay. There was space for him here in the first row. So the idea rose, and later on I will tell you who started that idea and where the inception began. Oh, he did join us eventually, okay. And we did something that is called disaggregation, so separation of hardware and software. For what reason? For the reasons of being able to have a unified operating system that should be based on the mainline Linux and sufficient support from the hardware vendors, both through technologies such as Switchdev or SAI or some other concepts, in order to be able to run distributions that are based on mainline Linux and that can work on a variety of hardware. So what are the benefits? Well, primarily, even though this is a bullet list that is not ordered, you could presume that cost is one of the primary benefits of having such system. So the idea behind this is to actually be able to have a network system that isn't driven by artificial end of life, by the vendor that you bought your networking equipment from, but rather having an open source following it and naturally have it community driven as it should be. But before I go into use cases, another thing that I often stumble upon is the fact that within the open source community, and this is probably less related to contributors and more related to users, the concept of mainlining is a bit vague and unknown. Why do we like mainline and why should we support mainline? Especially in a very complex project such as the Linux kernel, is the fact that the cost of backporting or forward porting your changes becomes incredibly expensive, and it is completely unmanageable after some amount of time that you keep yourself in the project within reasonable costs if you do not follow mainline. And you know how they say that money can buy pretty much anything. Well, unfortunately, in this particular case, this even can be very false. And it goes somewhere along the lines of how many of you here, and there is probably like 50, 60, or 70 of you, how many of you know how to write COBOL? And for those of you old who raise hands, yes, Razvan, I'm watching at you. So for those of you who potentially could know something about COBOL, would you be willing to take a legacy project and patch things in COBOL? You probably wouldn't. So even if we could find people that could assist us with trying to backport or forward port things for the new versions of kernel, that could not only become tremendously expensive, but in some cases, even impossible. And for that reason, the idea is, let's have a network operating system being open sourced and being within the scopes of mainline kernel. So the first use case, and actually the only one that I'm going to show you today because we have relatively short time and we have to speed up because I would presume that most of you here are very hungry by now. One of the great use cases is retail. You would not believe how much networking is needed in retail. And you probably wouldn't believe who is currently the main driver of the Dent project, and this is actually Amazon. It uses the Dent project on the switches within their retail stores, and don't forget their retail stores are completely self-serviceable, something along the lines, and you probably saw that in Zagreb. There is a Konzum store, I think on top of Kurelcheva near European Square, that is completely self-service. So you come inside, there aren't any clerks, everything is done automatically, and no, it's not working by magic. It actually, is there a, oh yes, there is. It actually works through network. So imagine this, you have 10,000 cameras, 500,000 labels, so digital signages that are all over the place, more than 400,000 sensors, 30 points of sales, and for those of you who are not fond of imperial, but rather would choose metrics, I don't know how many square meters this is, but let's say that it's a big store. Now imagine how difficult this is only from the infrastructural perspective. How difficult it is to hook 10,000 cameras to switches. You need 10,000 cables. Usually you need PoE as well. Sensors, digital signages, points of sales. Additionally, these points of sales have sensors for barcode scanners. They have digital scales. They have a variety of additional hardware. So these numbers simply rise. And as they rise, your demand for network rises as well. So within the scope of the Dent project, we are not actually targeting performance so much. There aren't switches that will allow you 100, 200, 400, 800 gigabits, 1.6 terabits, but will allow you to get the switches that can actually, for an affordable total cost of ownership, because do not look at this networking project only through CAPEX, look at it through the TCO. The TCO with the open source networking can dramatically be reduced. And this is the main purpose and motivator for a project like this. Of course, being guided through the Linux Foundation, it's very important to have all the components of a good project being incorporated. And even though I did mention that the project itself is not targeting the enterprise customers, and here enterprise being the sense of requirements of enterprise features, there are of course things that are awaited in the latest version, version 4 now. Version 3.2 is the actual one, which will incorporate some of the features that many of users are eagerly waiting for. And even though Switchdev is de facto a standard in the Linux kernel, SAI is something that is also required. Of course, support from vendors for SAI is to be expected, and a completely newly built system for these open source network operating systems, since unfortunately, if some of you folks in here ever tried building your own kernel, you know that this can be problematic in various ways. If you ever came across the necessity of building that kernel for something that is not PC, something that is, let's call it an embedded device, you could have witnessed the issues that can happen during that build process. Since Yocto is also LF's project, completely open source, there is a plan to create a build system based on Yocto. Of course, since the project started some time ago, it was tied to Debian 10. Don't frown, we are completely aware that this needs to be upgraded, and it will be upgraded to Debian 12. Some PoE features, hardening of 802.1x, and the ability for more seamless firmware upgrades. Of course, some of additional enterprise features such as multicast routing, PoE kernel integration, open config supports, packaging, which is very important. And even though most users take it for granted, okay, I have a Linux distribution, so that means that I necessarily need to have a packaging component inside it. This is just a feature nice to have and not something that is nor standardized nor required by any build that you have. Additionally, features like VXLANs, MCLAGs, BGPs here. So even though, once again, this is not high-end equipment targeted for the far end of enterprise, but something more numbed down, what the project is trying is to integrate some of the features that are also available on the other side of open network operating systems, that being the Sonic project, so adding networking features inside that could be potentially required by end users in future. Now, there is a lineup of Marvell chips that are supported in the Dent network operating system, but since this presentation should generally cover more of the open source, I just wanted to spare a minute in showing you a microchip Spark X5, so a chip that is fully open source, up to the level of registers, contains completely fully open source driver support. It's called Microchips Mesa, and additionally can follow and support latest Linux kernel. So after creating a network operating system, after creating a software support that can assist you to run it on X amount of hardware, next logical step that is required is to have a fully open source hardware as well. You are all probably aware of the RISC-V project. Okay, this one is ARM based, but generally speaking, more and more power, more and more focus is targeted to the open source hardware as well. We are all aware of the Open Power, the IBM's initiative that is already 5, 6, 7 years old. So things are coming to the open source basis, even in the hardware. Now, just very briefly, so who actually is within the Dent project? And yes, I will be very, very unfriendly, but the reason I'm here now is company Sartura. That's a Croatian company based in Zagreb. We are the members of the Linux Foundation and general members of the Dent project. But importance of this is that we are surrounded by Amazon, by EdgeCore, being one of the largest network ODMs in the world, Bootlin, Keysight, Luxoft, Winstore, PL Vision, our friends from Ukraine, Bizden, a German company, MyCast Networks. So honestly, all the big guns. And this is additional value of the Linux Foundation, the fact that even though we are small, there is only 30 of us, we are based in Zagreb, we are based in Croatia, we are very welcome, and we are participating and contributing in a very good Linux Foundation project. I'm telling you this as a motivation that if we succeeded, there isn't a limit for anyone else. So embrace open source, try to participate in it, try to work on it. It makes very good sense. Shortly about the governance, and this is once again, as I've said, the purpose of the Linux Foundation in general, to guide this project as it should be guided. And in the end, I think we have 2 more minutes. If there are any questions, I can distribute. Oh, you will do it. Thank you. So the mic can go to the audience. Thank you. Make it an easy question.
Well, I hope it should be easy.
Okay.
So the hardware, is it some switches which are easily obtainable? Are there some bare metal switches, or
are you talking about this or Marvell line?
You know, the open source variant, right?
So this is the only open source variant currently in existence.
Yes.
Okay. So it's up to 25 gigabits. So once again, it's not enterprise. And yes, it can be obtained, and yes, you can get in touch with me after we finish.
Okay.
Anyone else?
How long does it boot, this motherboard?
This particular, that's a very good question. Fantastic question. So there is I would presume that you are very well acquainted, and that is the reason why you asked. It doesn't boot very quickly, so it takes approximately, I would say, 15 to 20 seconds to get to a full start. But yes, there are switches that we also plan to support, probably through this project, industrial-based switches that have an instant boot on time. So the moment the electricity touches it, it should be able to distribute your package. I think that Microchip Laguna is the series of that kind of devices, and they're also open source. No. It's not because Dent is not Sonic. Okay, so we don't containerize anything. It's more close to bare metal than the Sonic is, and this is the reason why it can run on much inferior hardware.
Anyone else? Okay, that's it. Thank you, Bruno.
I think people are hungry, you know?
Yeah.
Let them eat. Thank you so much once again.